Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this important conversation. So my name is Alana Reimer. I am the Resource and Content Coordinator for the EFC's Ministry Partnership and Innovation Center. So I want to begin by gratefully acknowledging that my colleagues Beth, Julia, and I work out of the EFC's Ottawa office, which is on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. So just so that you have an idea where this hour is headed, for the first half hour, we'll hear an overview of some key issues and concerns surrounding medical assistance in dying, followed by an introduction to the No Options, No Choice campaign, which was launched by the Christian Medical and Dental Association of Canada. Then we'll hear a bit about a resource called LifeTogether, which is designed to help churches practice robust inclusion of the gifts and perspectives of people with disabilities in their congregations. We'll wrap up by sharing about a statement called DeclareAndResolve that's being signed by Christian organization leaders who are standing together to lament hastened death and the devaluing of human life. And then at the end, we'll leave about 15 minutes to answer any questions that you may have. So as you're listening to the panelists, feel free to type any questions that you have in the chat, and I'll keep track of those for our panelists. I'm also going to put a couple links in the chat in a second, and you can go to those links later if you want to find more information about the LifeTogether resource and the No Options, No Choice campaign. All right, so I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I will let them take it away. Julia Beasley is Director of Public Policy, and Beth Heemstra is Policy Analyst at the EFC's Center for Faith and Public Life. The Center for Faith and Public Life is focused on public engagement, bringing biblical principles to bear on policy issues, and seeking the common good of people across Canada. Both Julia and Beth, as I mentioned earlier, are speaking to you from Ottawa. And Larry Worthen has been the Executive Director of the Christian Medical and Dental Association of Canada since 2012. The CMDA helps engage, encourage, and equip Christian doctors and dentists to integrate their faith in their practices. And Larry is based in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Okay, Julia, over to you.
Thanks, Alana. So first, thank you so much to everyone who is joining us for taking the time out of your day to learn some more about what we believe is one of the most pressing and critical issues we're facing, not just in our policy work, but in our churches, our communities, and our country. So as Alana said, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of where we're at with MAiD in Canada, and then I'll turn things over to Larry to get us started thinking about what we can do. When the MAiD legislation passed back in 2016, the government's rationale was to bring an earlier death for those who were experiencing pain and suffering at the end of life, whose death was, as the legislation says, reasonably foreseeable. But in 2021, with the passing of Bill C-7, a second track for MAiD was created, making people with disabilities or chronic illness who weren't dying eligible if they met the other requirements. This meant MAiD was now available to people because they had a chronic illness or disability, putting them outside of the protections offered to other Canadians. So if I, as a non-disabled person, express a desire to die, the duty and hopefully impulse of the medical community is to intervene. They shouldn't suggest I end my life, and they cannot end it for me. But this same protection no longer exists for Canadians living with disability. This change was overwhelmingly opposed by disability rights activists and organizations. They cautioned that extending MAiD to people with disabilities who are not dying gives the implicit message that their lives are not worth living. They cautioned that people with disabilities would be at greater risk in a regime that accepts that certain lives can be ended, particularly in an overburdened medical system. And they argued that this change was discriminatory and would pressure people with disabilities to end their lives. And in the time since this expansion, its reality and implications for the lives of Canadians living with disability have become chillingly clear. Addressing a joint parliamentary committee that was studying the issue, Dr. Catherine Frazee, a professor and leader in the disability rights community, described it as the toxic notion that life with disability is optional and by extension disposable. She spoke powerfully of the incalculable damage of a catastrophic social experiment. And over the last many months, we have seen story after story of people with disability, chronic illness, or chronic pain who are requesting MAiD, not because they want to die, but because they can't access or afford the treatment or support they need, or they simply can't afford to live. We heard about Amir from St. Catherine's, who lives with disability and chronic pain, and was applying for MAiD because he was afraid he was going to lose his housing. He said, "I don't want to die, but I don't want to be homeless more than I don't want to die." Now, Amir withdrew his request for MAiD following an outpouring of tangible support in response to his story. But there are so many more like him facing similar circumstances. Les from Medicine Hat lost his disability benefits at 65 and plans to end his life by MAiD before he becomes homeless. He says, "The numbers I crunch, I will not make it. Like in my case, the problem is not really the disability, it's the poverty. It's the quality of life." I follow Les on Twitter, and even with what he's facing personally, he has actively tried to secure help for others who are facing similar circumstances. And Sophia was an Ontario woman with multiple chemical sensitivities who ended her life by MAiD after her search for affordable housing that was safe and healthy for her failed. Story after story after story. It is unconscionable that in Canada, people would choose to die because they can't afford or can't access the care and support they need to live and flourish. That it is easier for people to access MAiD than the care and supports they need to live. But tragically, this is the reality. And this should be unacceptable to every Canadian, certainly to every Christian. This change in the law is a society-wide expression of ableism or discrimination against people with disabilities. The lives of people with disabilities are being devalued and put at risk. We must reverse course on this. So we are calling, as those in the disability community are, for a repeal of Track 2 MAiD. We're also calling for a stop to the expansion of MAiD to those whose only underlying medical condition is mental illness. This expansion had been set to take place in March, but the Justice Minister introduced legislation to delay it until March 2024. And we are certainly grateful for the reprieve, but it's just a reprieve. The minister has made it very clear the government intends to move ahead with MAiD for mental illness. This is just a delay to give time for medical professionals to prepare for the coming change. But as a recent article in the Hill Times stated, they're still missing the point. Too much time is spent considering who should die rather than how to help people live. So one of the safeguards in the law is that people must be informed of their treatment options, but only informed. They don't actually have to receive treatment. And in far too many cases, treatment or support could be at the end of a months or years long waiting list. And despite the assurances we hear from MAiD providers and from the government that safeguards are working as they should, we know from all of these stories being told, from the disability community and from accounts we hear from colleagues, that it is simply not the case across the board. The existing safeguards are inadequate under our current reality, never mind with the immense additional complexity of mental illness alone. Statistics on Canadians and mental health tell us that if we ourselves are not struggling, someone in our family, someone we love, someone who is an essential part of our community is. And for far too many, support is often either unaffordable or not accessible in a timely way. The reflection period, as it's called, for Track 2 MAiD for those who aren't dying is just 3 months. But wait times for care can be months or years longer than this. 1 in 10 Canadians looking for counseling services will wait more than 4 months. For some, especially those requiring more specialized care, that wait will be much longer than 4 months. So this means that 1 in 10 Canadians could access MAiD more readily in a more timely way than they can mental health care. We're already seeing a clear connection between poverty, food, or housing insecurity and MAiD for people living with disability or chronic illness. We know that people with mental illness also often have trouble accessing healthcare, housing, food, and employment. So if that access is expanded, how many more Canadians, how many more of our neighbors will be pushed by circumstances to pursue MAiD? A delay is not enough. We need to stop the expansion of MAiD for mental illness. There has been a troubling and steady increase in deaths by MAiD over the past 6 years. Since the law was passed in 2016, 31,664 Canadians have ended their lives through MAiD. More than 10,000 had their lives ended by MAiD in 2021 alone, a 31% increase from the previous year. And I think we can anticipate the numbers for 2022 will be even higher. And we're likely to see access expand even further. A joint parliamentary committee tasked with studying several issues related to MAiD released its report last week. In it, they recommend the government allow MAiD for mature minors and also by advance request, which would mean patients wouldn't have to be able to consent at the time MAiD is provided. We grieve at this trend, at the devaluing and discarding of human life, that people in vulnerable situations are not being supported to live, but instead facilitated to die. And we believe this is a crucial time for the church to love our neighbors. We must be standing with and for those who are at their most vulnerable, who feel pressured by their circumstances, by a medical system in crisis to end their lives by MAiD. We know if we want to see a change to the laws, it will take a significant public outcry. So this is such an important moment for us to speak up, to join our voices with those who are most sharply and directly feeling the impacts of our laws. Those who are concerned should contact their MP and ask them respectfully and graciously to stop the expansion of MAiD and to reverse track to MAiD. Ask them how they will work to better support people with disabilities or mental illness. On our website, we have an action kit on MAiD and mental health. Please join us in asking MPs to stop this expansion. A delay, again, is not enough. Contact your MPs, share the kit widely. And as we call on government to stop the expansion, to right this wrong, and to ensure better support and care is available to all Canadians, let's also prayerfully consider what God would have us do as individuals, families, and churches to reach out to those around us who may be struggling or feeling isolated, to best support and care for our neighbors in times of vulnerability. We must be more than ever welcoming, including, ensuring full participation in church life and community for those with disability or chronic illness, or who struggle with their mental health. And we must also consider the church's response to society's ableism and the devaluing of life. How can we affirm in our words and actions the dignity of each and every human being, regardless of age, ability, illness, or social condition? How can we improve our welcome to people with disabilities and have a better grasp of this beautiful picture of the whole body of Christ together? Beth will talk some more about this in a bit, but first I will turn things over to Larry to tell you about the great work they're doing and how you can participate. Larry?
Thanks very much, Julia. That was it was a sad story you told, but it was a beautiful exhortation to all of us to remember our Christian values and to take action to deal with this horrible direction our country has taken. I want to talk to you today about a project called No Options, No Choice, which is a project that CMDA started in December of last year. I wonder if I could have my first slide, please. This project essentially tries to humanize or put faces to the challenges that Julia identified. Julia talked primarily about persons with disabilities and persons with mental health concerns. But it's even in the area of palliative care is problematic. When you look at the statistics that the Canadian government provides on euthanasia and the reasons that people have chosen MAiD, what you find is that over 50% of them are choosing MAiD because of a sense of a loss of personal dignity. About a third of them are choosing MAiD because of the desire not to be a burden on their families. Others are choosing it because of isolation and loneliness. Now, there's an expert in palliative care named Harvey Max Chochinov, who is a scholar and physician in Winnipeg. Dr. Chochinov wrote a book on dignity therapy. And he talks about all the reasons that people tend to lose dignity when they're sick and at end of life. And for each one of these reasons, Dr. Chochinov provides questions that we can answer, counseling questions. He also talks about interventions that we can have. And these interventions are within the competence of palliative care physicians. But the experts in palliative care tell us that only 30 to 50% of Canadians have access to proper palliative care. You see, it's really a fiction that it's uncontrolled pain that's causing MAiD, even at end of life. The palliative care doctors will tell us that all pain at end of life can be controlled and dealt with. What's causing the problem is that there's not sufficient palliative care resources. And the other piece of it is that people's suffering is not physical suffering, it's existential suffering. You see, the sad reality here is that as our society becomes more secularized, and God is no longer in the picture for many people at end of life, then they feel that they have to deal with this alone, that there's no one there to help them, no one there to support them. You know, there's such a need for palliative care, and only 30 to 50% have access. There's such a need for support for persons with disabilities. So many stories about people ending their lives because they were unable, for instance, to afford the housing that would be able to help them. But the other piece, as Julie already mentioned, is the mental health piece. It's gonna, once it becomes legal next year, 3 months is the waiting period. But the average waiting time to see a psychiatrist in Canada today is 6 months. So as Julia said, we're making it easier to end people's lives than we are for them to have the resources to be able to live. So our project tried to put a human face to this. And so we invited 4 people to participate in this. And each of them speaks about their own experience of being a vulnerable person in Canada. Tracy is the first lady on the left. She has lived with a disability for her whole life. Claire, who has stage 3 breast cancer and is living with a terminal illness. Sam and Julie. Sam is a young man who attempted suicide at the age of 20 and was not given proper resources. And Julie is someone who has also suffered from mental illness, has attempted suicide, and found that her only the best care that she could get was care that she and her family had to pay for, as opposed to what was accessible to her. By next year, when MAiD for mental health is legalized, all 4 of these people could die from MAiD. And they all understand how someone could make that decision because of the desperation and the vulnerability that they feel. But they also believe that it's the responsibility of society to come alongside them and to support them, to help them see that they are loved, worthwhile, and valuable. Because so often it's a question of morale and the will to keep going in the face of great adversity. You see, when I realized that it was because of mainly spiritual and emotional reasons that people were turning to MAiD, I realized that there was a tremendous role there for the church to come alongside, to support, and to assist. So could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, and here's some of the stories that were referred to earlier. The former Paralympian who told MPs that the Veterans Department offered her assisted death. From Global News, how poverty, not pain, is driving Canadians with disabilities to consider medically assisted death. A Winnipeg woman who chose to die with medical assistance said her struggle for home care help led to her decision. And finally, a story of a woman with chemical sensitivities who chose medically assisted death after a failed bid to get better housing. That particular story was heartbreaking because that woman had chemical sensitivities and could not find accommodation to be able to live in a healthy way. We would not even know her story unless she had videotaped her story before she died and gave it to her family and asked the family to give it to the media. And it came out to the media, and everyone realized that this lady died because of inability to pay for her housing. So our goal with the campaign is to basically connect people, Canadians, and give them a mechanism to speak directly to the provincial governments, to encourage the governments at the provincial level to ensure that there are sufficient services for all of these people and all of these groups. Because unless we do that, unless we ensure that, people are going to continue to choose MAiD. If you reduce palliative care budgets, then there's going to be less people to provide alternatives, and logically more people are going to choose MAiD. What's currently happening in many provinces now is that the provincial governments have requested that palliative care departments actually create a MAiD service within their envelope of funds. So essentially, the governments are taking money away from palliative care and giving it to the MAiD service, which is very, very wrong. So the idea is the website is there. It allows people to go on, watch videos of each of these 4 individuals. It's in French and English. It's no charge to use any of this. And it gives people an opportunity within 2 minutes. A person can go in, put in their name, email, and postal code. Their MLA's name will come up. There are sample emails that they can send, and they can send emails directly to their provincial politicians. So far across Canada, we've had 7,200 people write in and express their concerns. We need many more than that. And so we're hoping that pastors and other interested people might be willing to do this campaign in their church. And we have a whole range of materials. Just before we show you the materials, I'd like to show you a video so you can get to meet Tracy, Claire, and Sam.
When Canada was first thinking about a law for medical assistance in dying, I was quite concerned that this would be a slippery slope.
By definition, I would qualify for MAiD. It bothers me a lot. It makes me feel unsettled that it would be so easy for me to start that process, and it's a real thing. If I was alone, if I didn't have the help, if I didn't have the money, a drug plan to pay for my medications, where would I turn to?
It distresses me to be in a society that makes it easier for a person to choose death from a so-called menu of health options than to choose life because of having services in place.
We have many programs to help people with a multitude of things. But they don't seem to be accessible for everybody.
It is vital that federal and provincial governments make mental health care more accessible. My story should not have happened. I should not have been given a bus pass and a wave goodbye at the hospital.
For palliative care, it's a wonderful field of medicine, and it's advancing all the time.
If a person cannot get help to get, up in the morning or get, enough meals a day, or, get out of the house sometimes when they want to be able to do that, those things affect their quality of life more than their disability itself affects their quality of life.
So the government has really got to put in place means, money, groups, everything is needed to help people with their individual needs.
It scares me the most that a lot of innocent people will lose their lives because they feel there is no path forward. They feel there is no way out. And they don't realize in that stage in their minds that life can get better.
All Canadians do not currently have access to all of the supports that they need. If they had those supports, I don't think they would put MAiD on the top of their list.
So we have developed materials that can be used by churches to help parishioners get involved in this campaign. It includes a poster, a sample video, a bulletin insert, a letter that the pastor can send to people on an email mailing list, and a slide that can be used in congregations. And that's all can be used to help people become aware of the project. Now, hopefully, the link to the Google Drive with all this material in it will be on your chat. And I just want to close by thanking the EFC for their leadership on this issue, particularly the staff who we've worked with. We are all upset by the turn that our country has taken in this. But if we could just mobilize the Christian community, not just in the way I'm talking, which is to make our provincial governments aware of this, but also to mobilize individual Christians to pray for the dignity of human life, for us to remember that Christ himself identified with the most vulnerable in the 25th chapter of Matthew. Whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do so to me. And for our church communities to be places where vulnerable people can come and be supported and cared for. You know, most of our churches have visitation programs for the sick and the elderly. But this ministry is suddenly crucially important because now you could save a life with a visit. And then not just people in our churches, but also people in our communities. And that's why I'm so excited about the project that Beth and Julia have been working on. So Beth is going to talk about that now.
Thanks, Larry. Yes, I'm excited to share with you about a new EFC resource on disability and belonging in the church. It's called LifeTogether. This resource, the seeds for putting this resource together were really sown as we listened to people with disabilities share about the impact of the assisted dying laws. The most recent law that was passed, Bill C-7, is such a clear example of discrimination against people with disabilities, that the only people who aren't dying who are eligible for MAiD are people with disabilities, that having a disability makes them eligible for assisted death. And it was as we listened to people with disabilities and as we looked at the discrimination in the law, and as we recognized the ableism in our broader culture, we realized that we needed to take a closer look at ourselves and at our church communities as well. So we asked people in the disability community to share with us what welcome and belonging in the church look like, to share their thoughts on biblical teaching, and to give us examples of what ableism in the church can look like. We wanted to center the voices and the gifts of people with disabilities and to learn from them. So there are so many insights in LifeTogether, but there are a few that stood out to me. Cynthia Tam is an Alliance pastor and the National Coordinator for Disability Ministry. And she shared that a common misunderstanding among churches is that people with disabilities are the people with needs, and that Christian ministry is an act of charity. But Cynthia points to 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul teaches us to see the body of Christ as a united body with different members. And every member is equally valuable. Every member bears the gift of the Spirit for the good of the body. Or, as Jasmine Duckworth from Christian Horizons put it, we need to welcome each other as we are and recognize the gifts that each of us brings to the group. I was so grieved when Keith Dow from Christian Horizons shared with us that most families or people he's met who experience disability have experienced rejection or opposition from a church community at some point. And I was really struck when Jasmine Duckworth pointed out that many churches have accessible seating in the sanctuary, but an inaccessible stage. So while LifeTogether gives us a lot to think about in terms of things to be changed, it also gives us a beautiful picture of what the body of Christ can look like. One of my favorite quotes is by Taylor Hyatt. She talks about navigating the obstacles in traveling with a wheelchair, and she explains that it's just what you do when you love someone and want them to be part of your life. For Taylor's close friends, her participation isn't questioned or called burdensome, it's a given. And I think that's a really beautiful way for us to think in the church as well. As we love one another as Christ has loved us, we don't question the effort that it takes to make sure our brothers and sisters in Christ can participate fully. As Taylor says, it's just what you do when you love someone. LifeTogether is intended to help us think about what it means to be the body of Christ together, to evaluate how we're doing with our welcome, and to think about the next steps we can take as churches. It lists resources, it has tips for interacting, and it asks reflection questions as well. LifeTogether is a free resource, and it's available online and in print as a booklet. We hope that you'll get a copy to read and to share with your church and community. And Julia has another initiative that she wants to share with you about.
Thanks, Beth. We are so hopeful this resource will make a big impact. So yeah, excuse me, just one more thing to mention before we wrap up. Today, we are making public a statement that has been signed by the heads of many EFC affiliate organizations and denominations, the Declare and Resolve statement. The EFC initiated this statement out of deep concern and grief that Canadians are asking for MAiD because they feel they have no other options. The statement laments hastened death in Canada and declares that as followers of Jesus, we share a deep and profound commitment to the sanctity of all human life. Human life is being devalued and discarded when people in vulnerable situations among us are not being supported to live, but facilitated to die. How then will we respond? So even as we advocate for changes to the law and call on Christians across Canada to do the same, we need to be mindful to reach out and to care for those around us who may be struggling. Those who have signed affirm the duty of care we owe to one another. They commit to demonstrate the love of God to people who feel abandoned and without hope, to mobilize their communities to care for and comfort their neighbors who are suffering and alone, and to ensuring that people with disability, chronic illness, and mental health struggles are welcomed into full participation in churches and communities. And I think those are commitments we can all make wherever we are. In fact, we want to invite congregations, families, and organizations all across the country to join us in this commitment. Please consider affirming this statement with your congregation. Resolve to reach out in tangible ways to those around you who are struggling. We actually heard last week from a church in BC that had done this. They'd shared the statement with their congregation in a Sunday service. The statement was read, and then the congregation stood and read through the affirmation and commitment statements at the end together. It was very powerful and encouraging. This is something that is so close to the heart of God, to the heart of the gospel, and to our calling as followers of Jesus. So we invite you to check out the statement. You can find it on our website at www.TheEFC.ca/DeclareAndResolve. Thanks again. Ilana?
Thanks, Julia. I was just going to share that, the link there for the Declare and Resolve statement.
Thank you.
So we're going to transition into a Q&A time. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We have a couple here already. So Julie, I'll start with you. There's one, a question just around how easy it is to access MAiD due to poverty. So I wonder if you have a comment about that, about the connection between MAiD and poverty.
Sure. Yeah, I think it was fair enough, right? Stating it's hard to believe that this would be offered just on the basis of poverty. So people still have to meet the eligibility criteria in the legislation, a grievous and irremediable medical condition, enduring suffering and so on. But what's happening is that, people are making it very clear, all these stories we're hearing in the media, they're being very clear about the fact that, yes, they meet the eligibility criteria because of their disability or because of their chronic illness or chronic pain or whatever they're dealing with, but that is not the motivation. They're very clearly stating that the reason they are seeking this is because, they can't afford housing, or they're afraid of losing their housing, or they can't afford to pay for medications and food, or just all of these different circumstances relating to poverty, marginalization, isolation, and so on, as Larry said. So those should be criteria that would sort of lead assessors to exclude people possibly, but because they meet, they technically meet the criteria on paper, people are being approved for MAiD, even though their motivation in seeking it is not primarily the suffering due to their medical condition or disability.
I don't know, Larry, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that a lot of people don't understand how the system works. This was confirmed for me the other day by a lady who does a lot of MAiD in downtown Toronto, and she has the same concerns we do about the current system. The criteria themselves are extremely ambiguous and very malleable. The test is in the mind of the doctor, so the test is the doctor's subjective opinion that these criteria are in place, and there are many people who do assessments for MAiD who believe that the law should be that anyone who asks for it should be able to get it. They look only at the criteria, and it's like a checklist. So if you check off everything on the list, then you get MAiD, regardless of what your motivation is. The numbers of doctors who do this in Canada are very small. We estimate less than 1% of all physicians in Ontario have ever done an assessment or ever ended a patient's life using euthanasia. So there are doctors who have done 300 or 400 of these. The assessor parachutes in, doesn't need to talk to the other physicians that are caring for the patient, doesn't need to talk to the family. Very often these assessments are done in an hour or less. So that's the level of care. The issue of whether there could be some other factor that could be alleviated is something that's not even part of the assessment process. I want to make sure that's absolutely clear, because everyone thinks, oh, surely doctors wouldn't be like that. Well, they are. And these issues are extraneous. As long as someone qualifies under the checklist, they get paid.
Larry, in your presentation, you mentioned public funding being directed from palliative care towards supporting MAiD. So we had a question in the chat about where people can find information about that shift of public funding being moved towards MAiD instead of palliative care.
So far, because our association includes a lot of palliative care physicians, I'm in direct contact with them. So this is anecdotal evidence that I'm getting, but it's coming from multiple provinces. So I wouldn't say it's happening everywhere, but there are very clearly areas where the palliative care funding is being reduced because MAiD is it's required that MAiD be provided within that envelope.
Okay. I'll also direct this question to you, Larry, but anyone can jump in. And there's a question related to, is there ways that municipalities can do something about MAiD, such as declaring like a no MAiD zone, for example, asking local residences and hospitals to sign a voluntary pledge, or imposing other means of discouraging doctors, fines or taxes as examples. So yeah, do you want to jump in on that one? Are there ways that we can consider limiting MAiD or creating safe zones on a local level?
Well, I'd like to do that, or believe that we could do that, but the MAiD lobby in Canada is extremely powerful, and we ran up against this as our association, and the EFC certainly supported us on the issue of conscience rights, and the MAiD lobby in Canada is extremely powerful. And very often politicians are even afraid of the MAiD lobby, which should concern us because of the vulnerability of patients. But I think that we need more and more of these things. But I think that the place to start is to ensure that there are resources there for people, either available at the church or available, through the provincial governments, to ensure that there are alternatives to MAiD. I think that's our first thing. I'd love to see safe spaces, but there was a hospice, the Delta Hospice in BC, that was just absolutely attacked by the pro-MAiD lobby. Even to the point of their building was expropriated. The pro-MAiD lobby tried to take over their society. So this has been my concern all throughout. We need to mobilize Christians. If Christians were mobilized in the same way as the people who are against life, I think we could make a lot of changes in Canada. And these are the types of things we need to push back. And hopefully we can do that through some of the mechanisms that you've heard of today.
Yeah. I think most hospices and palliative care facilities, right, they want to be those safe places, but as Larry said, the pressure on them is growing. In fact, I haven't read the legislation yet, but I think that the Quebec government just tabled legislation that would require hospices to provide MAiD. I'm not certain of that, but
yeah, no, I saw that too, Julia. Yes, yeah. I saw that too.
Yeah. And again, Larry mentioned conscience protection for medical professionals. And that's one of the reasons why that is so essential, not just to protect the medical professional from moral injury and having to do things that violate their conscience or their better judgment in some cases, but also to create safe places for patients who want to know that they have a healthcare provider who will not recommend MAiD to them, who will not push them in that direction. So we need to push for that as well.
Yeah, if I could just ask everyone to please pray for Christian healthcare professionals in Canada. This is an awful time for them, because I've heard stories which I believe are accurate, because I've heard firsthand about doctors who have spoken to patients. Patients have indicated they want MAiD, they're headed in that direction. The doctor has spoken to them, raised alternatives with them. The patient has said, yes, I would like an alternative. And then the doctor is criticized by the family and by their colleagues, and even to the point of concern being raised that there may be a complaint to the college because the doctor is obstructing MAiD. So we're at a point in our healthcare system where death has become morally equivalent to life. There's no assumption that life is the default. Death has now become an outcome of the healthcare system. And as a result, those who stand up for life or feel it's better for a patient to be alive than dead are now seen to be people who are obstructing this new direction that society is headed in.
Kind of along those lines, there's another comment in the chat just telling the story of a father who was in hospital, and there was that pressure of why would he want to live, and them wanting their bed, and he was thankfully able to move into a hospice. But there is that sense of pressure, as you were saying, Larry, around, rather than a default of course we should be protecting patients. There's a bit of a shift, which I think that language is quite tricky around right to access this, right? Rather than right to life.
Yeah, we had our first example in Calgary, the first one that I had heard of, where a patient gave as their reason for wanting MAiD that she wanted to free up a bed for someone else. So you see, the pressure is very subtle, in some cases not so subtle. The patients realize that healthcare is scarce, and they feel, anyone who's done any pastoral care knows that it's very common for people to feel guilty because they're a burden. Now, this is just the same thing on steroids, and leading people to feel guilty about taking up a bed and wanting to end their lives so that someone else can have their bed. And it's sad that the mismanagement in the healthcare system is leading people to actually sacrifice their lives.
Yeah. I just seeing a comment from Dr. Paul Saba in the chat. And yes, absolutely. I think we would all agree 100% that we need to insist on full healthcare and social services. That's the foundation of the no options, no choice, right? If this is framed so often in the context of choice, but when people don't actually have choices, that doesn't really work. I'm glad to hear that you are on that committee. We need to have people in those spaces. Yeah, that must be difficult work. We will pray for you.
I want to leave space if there are any final questions for panelists. In the meantime, just a reminder, if you want to rewatch this webinar, you can access it at TheEFC.ca/webinars. I will put that in the chat. But just any last questions, and if, while people are thinking, any last comments from panelists?
I think just one other thing that last question reminded me of also is that there is pressure within the Association of MAiD providers that doctors would actually have to raise this with patients. And that sets us apart from other countries. I think we need explicit legislation, ideally guidelines at minimum, that say requests for medical assistance in dying must be patient initiated. Medical professionals should not be bringing this up as an option with their patients, because we tend to trust our medical professionals and think that what they recommend to us is something that we should follow. So I think that's something we need to pursue as well.
Yeah, I would really agree with that, Julia. You're absolutely right on that. Just imagine once MAiD becomes legal for people with psychiatric illness. I mean, it's common for people to come to their doctor or psychiatrist or counselor and say they want to, they're thinking about ending their lives. Well, does that mean that the psychiatrist then, I mean, if you follow the policy around effective referral, then the requirement would be, rather than treatment, that you would have to refer the patient for an assessment. So when you put all these pieces together, you realize the big picture, and the big picture is that the people behind this are trying to normalize suicide. This is what the inevitable conclusion that this comes to. It's moving faster than I ever dreamed it would, and it just seems to me that it's undermining the protection that vulnerable people have in our society.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So thank you to Julia, Larry, and Beth for your insightful comments on the work that you do. And let's keep praying and working together for those who are vulnerable and affirming the dignity of human life. As I had said, there's a link in the chat for where you can rewatch this webinar at TheEFC.ca/webinars. And thank you all for everyone who came today. That will conclude today's webinar. So blessings to you on this Tuesday.
Thanks.